Thank you, President. I move that the bill be read a second time, and in moving that, we'll now speak. This is a very important debate, and I'm sure there are many in the chamber who would agree that at a time like this, in the context that we are facing as part of a global economy and as a nation that's struggling with a number of economic, amongst other issues ourselves, it's important that we provide certainty to all parts of our community and all parts of our economy, and making sure that those that generate economic activity, small, medium businesses out there and the hundreds of thousands of people that work in those businesses have that certainty as well. Looking at the uncertainty we do face at the moment, I think it is, again, as I say, important to take stock of the context against which this private senator's bill is being debated. And just in doing that, I do want to pay tribute to Senator Bridget McKenzie, who did introduce this bill in the last parliament at a time when things were slightly different, though not incredibly different, and the work that she's put into the drafting of this bill and bringing it forward again in the 47th parliament. As I say, though, here we are in Australia and we're facing a great many domestic economic pressures, Mr Deputy President, and matters that there is no handbook to just pull off the shelf and provide a response for government to deal with these issues. But there is one tried and true thing that a government can adopt, and that is the matter of certainty. When you look at inflation and where that's predicted to go, the impact that that's going to have on the cost of living and all other segments of the economy. Power prices, even in my home state of Tasmania, where they're going up by 12%, something that is going to hit small businesses and households alike. The cost of food, fuel, and of course mortgage interest rates too, going in the direction that they are. All of these things are generating incredibly uncertain times, and it's something that we need to look at every tool we possibly can. As legislators, the government needs to look at every tool it has at its disposal as a Commonwealth government, along with state and territory governments, to provide certainty as one measure to respond to these times of uncertainty. Of course, also as we emerge and continue to emerge from COVID, where the world was an unpredictable place, we've seen an incredible pattern of behaviours and an incredible pattern of different economic indicators too. Who could have predicted through COVID we would have seen the growth in the housing and construction sector that we did for that time, thanks to stimulating measures on the part of many state and territory governments, and indeed the last federal government with its Home Builder program. But there is one thing Australian businesses and households are looking for, and that is, of course, certainty. That's the one thing they're asking for, it's the one thing they're calling for, and this bill provides a pathway for one such example. I think we can all acknowledge that forestry as an industry for time immemorial has been kicked about by emotive arguments, and often ones that lack scientific basis. And that has resulted in a downscaling of the industry, in job losses, in a reduction of economic activity, particularly in regional communities. It also, of course, means less resource available to our country, particularly, and I've already touched on the increased demand for the resource, particularly at a time when we need it. And I might also point out it's a resource that is indeed, given the way we do forestry in this country, a renewable resource. And of course, on top of that, given the, I think, by and large, good track record that forestry as an industry has, of course with exception, and I think we all need to acknowledge that, but good conservation outcomes. And it's something we do need to pay tribute to, is that this industry relies on the environment it operates in to continue to operate. They are good custodians of the land, the forests and the land on which they work, and they do it based on science. They do it based on world's best practice. And on that claim, I also make another claim, and that is that we do it better than anywhere else in the world. I'm yet to hear of examples of another jurisdiction that do forestry, both native and plantation, to the same standard that we do here in Australia, be it the regulation that is imposed on this industry at a state or territory level, or indeed through the RFAs, it does lead to positive outcomes that are of benefit to our nation and to the people that work here, the people that live here. There are economic benefits. I've already talked about those, and I think they're pretty obvious for anyone who's listening. Of course, the environmental benefits that I talked about before, reforestation, which is part of our forestry management regime. We don't just go out there, clear fell and leave the land denuded. We actually seek to reforest so that we have continuing and sustained availability of resource. Innovation, investments in innovation are central to ensuring that we have a strong and vibrant forestry future. Getting more products out of less resource is critically important, having less waste at the end of the production cycle, and of course the science that goes into that innovation, centrally important. And at the last election, both major parties committed over $100 million to science, innovation and research through our Super NIFBI, as it's called, and that will feed further into better outcomes. And of course the carbon outcome of forestry, the capacity for our productive forests to sequester carbon and do a great deal of heavy lifting when it comes to our carbon abatement, the job that we have as a nation to fulfil our global responsibilities. The forestry industry does a huge part of that for our country. And indeed the proud, hard-working men and women that work in this sector as well, that get besmirched every other day of the week by those who just seek to take this industry down. And it might be a good opportunity for my colleagues down the end there to not rile me up, and I'll keep it pretty tame too. So, given all of this, it does beg the question why we wouldn't back the industry, and of course, if you don't, where do you get the resource from? Two pretty central questions around this bill, and indeed what happens in a world where this bill does not take effect. Conservative estimates we've repeated ad nauseum in this place and, of course, and the other, and out in the public domain as well, that demand for timber products is going to increase fourfold by the year 2050. And there are a myriad of reasons that feed into that. They be mainly in the housing and construction sector for timber framing, for staircases, window frames, the like, flooring, for furniture and decorative applications, amongst others. The demand is heading in that direction, and of course native timber, the forests that we are contemplating here in the debating of this bill, are central to the provision of the resource that is required to fulfil that demand. And they say, there's some stats out there now, that 30% of any home built these days is of hardwood and therefore coming from native forests. So, bearing in mind the world-leading status of our forestry industry and those who work in it, you've got to wonder why we wouldn't back it. And of course, that second question I asked before, where does the resource come from if we aren't taking it from well-managed, world-leading, science-based Australian forests? We often get it from overseas. This is the thing. If we're not producing it here, we're taking it from overseas nations where we don't have the same assurances, we don't have the same guarantees around the resource and the sustainability of the management models they have in place in those nations. We don't know what environmental outcomes, we don't know what conditions for workers in those forests and those mills exist. And so without strong regimes in those corresponding nations around traceability and labelling, it is very difficult for us to know with any confidence, and I'll come to some facts in a moment around other nations and their track records. It's very difficult for us as a country that do value environmental management, that do value conditions for employees in these often dangerous environments, whether the timber we are importing and buying will in any way be the standard we require of ourselves and expect as consumers of this resource. And look, in the last term of parliament, I was pleased to see a DNA testing program in many of our timber retail outlets. And the scary thing was, and I'm pleased that we were able to reveal this, that many of our very high-profile retailers were marketing and selling product claiming to be a particular species of timber sourced from a sustainable forest overseas. But the DNA testing revealed that, in fact, it wasn't. It wasn't that timber, and indeed it didn't come from a sustainable source. And I implore the Albanese government to consider continuing this program, because I think it is important. If we're going to impose high standards on our timber industry, and rightly so, it's a set of impositions that the industry would welcome and, of course, help them with their brand, we should continue to do that for overseas sources and those who import them. But to that point, we are bringing our timber in from overseas, and one such point of origination is the nation of Brazil. A lot of timber comes in, and we've got a void here that we are seeking to fill. As I said before, demand quadrupling by the year 2050. Where are we getting this timber from? It's not coming out of thin air. It's certainly not coming out of Australian forests. It's coming from overseas. So Brazil, and I did a bit of research earlier on, and I came across a number of facts that worried me quite significantly about what we, who still want to buy the products, but we are finding it less and less possible to do so here in Australia, using Australian timber, sustainably managed, sustainably sourced and done to the world's best standard. We still want to buy the product, but we are forcing ourselves to buy it from overseas. And so you look at Brazil, and for the first half of this year, for the first half of 2022, the Amazon rainforest reached a record high in terms of deforestation for the first 6 months of this year. An area 5 times the size of New York City was destroyed, government data showed. So from January to June, 3,988 square kilometres was cleared. And of course, you can't just say, oh, well, that's a matter for them, because turning your back on the rest of the world when we are good global citizens, I think, is an important thing for us to do. We set an example and we expect others to follow. And this very same report talks about how this clearing regime, not done in accordance with any science, not done to the world's best standard as it is here in Australia, after loggers extract valuable wood, ranchers and land grabbers set fire to what's left to clear the land for agriculture. So here they are indeed contributing also not only to deforestation but to carbon emissions, which is something I would have thought many in this place would be opposed to supporting. But this is what happens when we strangle our industry here by not providing certainty. We are forcing demand offshore. We are sourcing from unsustainable forests offshore. And, of course, sending the jobs with them. And I could go on about Brazil at length, but let's turn to the continent of Africa and the deforestation in the Congo Basin, particularly in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And, of course, we're seeing, if you're looking at the measurement of the amount of timber being ripped out of the Congo Basin, wood removal, which is measured in cubic metres, is continuing to increase annually. Industrialised roundwood, which is of course used for the purposes I've been talking about, has increased from 3.05 million cubic metres in 1990 to 4.45 million cubic metres in 2010. So if we think that these forests are being managed well and in accordance with world's best practice, you only have to consider claims like Congo Basin rainforest may be gone by 2,100 study finds, and the facts that I've already put on record. We do forestry well here, and that was the point behind Senator Mackenzie's private senator's bill, the bill we're debating today. Now, of course, there have been events that have happened since the bill was first introduced in the Federal Court of Australia, and that's great. But we are in the business of providing certainty. We are in the business of making sure that this industry, which is world-leading, which does not have headlines like the ones I've just read out, does not have academic studies pointing to terrible outcomes like the ones I've just referred to, our industry is one that is sustainable, one that we should be proud of, one that supports tens of thousands of jobs in regional communities and billions of dollars of economic productivity and revenue for Australian households and businesses, all the while providing good environmental outcomes. And so this is why it is important for us to remove all doubt. It's great that the Federal Court reached the conclusion that they did, but let's not leave people in doubt. Let's show the government's intent for this particular industry, amongst other great primary industries, and make sure it has the support it needs. That certainty I mentioned earlier on, the one thing businesses and households are looking for anywhere they can get it, certainty from government through its policy, its regulation and its legislation. Now, we know, of course, that at a time in the future the new government will present to this parliament its response to the Samuels review, a review which I might add has been out and in the public domain for some time, but that will also make a change to what we're debating here. So let's put a marker in the ground, let's support this industry and let's support this bill.